Russia shifts strategic bombers west as both sides trade long-range strikes, and Ukraine appoints a new defense minister amid growing political tension. Israel strikes Syria's Abu al-Duhur airbase as tensions rise over a possible expansion of Turkey's military presence. The U.S.-Iran confrontation widens around the Strait of Hormuz as Gulf states tighten pressure, and Tehran weighs responses beyond the region. Trump turns back toward Asia, scaling down major drills with South Korea while reopening channels with Kim Jong-un and preparing for talks with Xi Jinping. Russia and Myanmar expand cooperation across energy, infrastructure, and military technical ties. And in Leaders on X, Marco Rubio targets the ICC with new sanctions. Israel Katz reiterates Israel's Gaza strategy, and Emmanuel Macron marks a historic French spacewalk. Russia is repositioning part of its strategic aviation force toward the west as both sides continue long-range strikes. Satellite imagery and aviation monitoring indicate that several Tu-95 strategic bombers departed the Ukrainka air base in Russia's Far East and were moving toward the European part of the country. Earlier reporting also pointed to aircraft shifting toward Engels and Savosleka. The movement does not confirm an imminent strike, but it could increase Russia's capacity for another large missile operation. Russian military sources say Geran-2 drones struck the Europa industrial complex in Zaporizhzhia, where a fire was reported in one building. Separate Russian reports said a strike hit the regional national police headquarters in Zhytomyr. On the Dnipropetrovsk direction, Russia's defense ministry says a FAB-3000 bomb struck a temporary Ukrainian deployment site. Russian forces also reported a Grad rocket strike on a fortified position near Dobropilya. In the Black Sea, Russian military sources say Geran drones struck two Ukrainian cargo vessels allegedly used to transport military supplies. That claim has not been independently confirmed. On the ground, Russia's defense ministry says units of the center grouping captured Vodyansky in the Donetsk region. Moscow also says it sees no viable option for freezing the conflict along the current front line. Ukraine continues long-range attacks inside Russia. Ukrainian sources report a drone strike on the Bashneft refinery in Ufa, with a fire near the ELOUAVT-6 unit and nearby pipeline infrastructure. A large fire was also reported at a site described as an electrical substation in Cheboksary, although the cause remains unclear. In Kyiv, Parliament approved Yevhen Kmara as defense minister with 312 votes in favor. Mikhailo Fedorov, now outside the government, has called for a mechanism to hold presidential elections during the war. Searches were also reported at the offices or homes of lawmakers, while claims that anti-corruption searches were used to pressure deputies remain political allegations. Fedorov's supporters protested outside Parliament after Kmara's appointment. Russia and Ukraine also completed a new prisoner exchange with 103 servicemen returned to each side. Moscow said the Russian personnel were first transferred to Belarus before being taken home, while Ukrainian officials separately confirmed the return of 103 of their servicemen. Israel has carried out a new series of strikes on Syria's Abu al-Duhur airbase in Idlib, targeting the runway, storage areas, and other military infrastructure at the facility. The attack involved 8 strikes, according to reports from the scene. Israel confirmed the operation and linked it to concerns that Turkey could expand its military presence at the base. From Israel's perspective, a permanent or larger Turkish deployment there could create a new strategic foothold inside Syria and add another armed actor to an already crowded military environment. The strike is therefore being read not only as an attack on a Syrian military site, but also as a warning over the future shape of Turkey's role in the country. Ankara has not confirmed plans for a permanent deployment at Abu al-Duhur, but Turkish influence in Syria remains a central part of the wider regional balance. Damascus condemned the Israeli action, while Turkey also criticized the strikes. The response highlights the risk that repeated Israeli operations inside Syria could increasingly collide with Turkish security interests, especially if Ankara expands its military cooperation with the Syrian authorities. Washington is now trying to keep that tension from turning into a direct confrontation. U.S. officials are working on a deconfliction channel involving Israel, Turkey, and Syria, with the goal of reducing the risk of miscalculation and preventing separate military moves from triggering a broader crisis. The issue goes beyond one airbase. Israel is signaling that it intends to challenge military developments in Syria that it considers a threat, while Turkey is seeking to preserve room to shape Syria's security architecture and its own position there. That creates a situation in which both sides can increase pressure without necessarily seeking a direct clash. For Israel, the immediate objective appears to be deterrence, making clear that it is prepared to act against infrastructure it believes could support a future Turkish military buildup. For Turkey, the question is whether it will adjust its plans or continue expanding its security role in Syria despite Israeli pressure. The next step will depend on whether Abu al-Duhur remains an isolated flashpoint or becomes part of a wider contest over military access, bases, and influence inside Syria. Any confirmed Turkish deployment would sharply raise the stakes, while further Israeli strikes could test the new US-backed deconfliction effort almost immediately. The confrontation around Iran and the Strait of Hormuz is moving into a broader regional crisis, with diplomacy stalled, shipping under pressure, and the risk of escalation spreading beyond the Gulf. President Donald Trump says there are no talks with Iran underway or scheduled. Washington also maintains that the naval blockade remains in force and that the Strait of Hormuz is open. Tehran rejects that position and says the waterway will not fully reopen until the United States meets Iranian conditions. The pressure is now reaching neighboring Gulf states. The United Arab Emirates has imposed an indefinite trade embargo on Iran after accusations of Iranian missile attacks. Tehran denies responsibility and has warned Gulf governments against helping U.S. forces. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has also discussed security in the Strait of Hormuz with UAE officials. Concern over maritime security is spreading farther south. Japan and Yemen have discussed protection of commercial shipping, including Coast Guard training, maritime surveillance, search and rescue operations, and counter-smuggling cooperation. The talks reflect concern over the routes linking the Persian Gulf, the Arabian Sea, and the Red Sea. Another development involves Russia. Western reporting says Moscow has been supplying Iran with explosives, ammunition, and components for drones through the Caspian Sea. If sustained, those deliveries could help Tehran rebuild military stocks. Iran is also reportedly studying options outside the Middle East. Iranian planners have considered possible strikes on U.S. military facilities in southeastern Europe if Washington launches another major attack. Bulgaria and Cyprus have been mentioned among possible locations. Iranian forces have also reportedly examined attacks on subsea communications cables around Hormuz. Together, these developments show how quickly the confrontation is expanding. The crisis is no longer limited to one shipping corridor. It now touches Gulf trade, U.S. military infrastructure, European security, and critical communications networks. President Donald Trump is shifting attention toward Asia, combining a softer military signal on the Korean peninsula with renewed outreach to both Pyongyang and Beijing. The United States and South Korea are cutting the Ulchi Freedom Shield exercises roughly in half and ending the drills earlier than originally planned. The reduced schedule comes as Washington looks for room to reopen diplomacy with North Korea. Trump says Kim Jong-un has already responded to him very positively. He did not explain how the contact took place or what message was exchanged, but the statement suggests communication between Washington and Pyongyang may be moving beyond public signals. Seoul, meanwhile, is still emphasizing military readiness. President Lee Jae-myung wants wartime operational control transferred to South Korea before the end of his term and is also pushing the country's nuclear-powered submarine program. That means diplomacy with Pyongyang is developing alongside an effort to give Seoul greater military autonomy. At the same time, Washington is preparing for another major Asian diplomatic track. Xi Jinping is expected to visit the United States on September 24 for talks with Trump. Trade, Taiwan, artificial intelligence, and regional security are expected to be among the main issues. Taken together, the moves point to a broader Trump effort to reshape U.S. strategy in Asia through direct diplomacy. With China, the stakes are wider, ranging from trade and technology to military competition in the Indo-Pacific. With North Korea, the immediate test is whether Kim's reported response leads to formal talks. The next step will show whether Washington can lower tensions with Pyongyang while opening a new negotiating track with Beijing without weakening the security guarantees its Asian allies still depend on. Russia and Myanmar are expanding cooperation across energy, infrastructure, and defense following talks in Moscow between President Vladimir Putin and Min Aung Hlaing. The two sides discussed nuclear power and oil refinery, port infrastructure, LNG supplies, and broader hydrocarbon cooperation. Several documents were signed during the visit, including agreements covering the energy sector. Military technical cooperation also remains part of the relationship, alongside plans to deepen trade and investment ties. The talks also covered labor migration and wider commercial links, showing that the partnership is moving beyond defense into a broader economic framework. For Moscow, the agreements strengthen Russia's presence in Southeast Asia. For Myanmar, they offer access to Russian technology, energy expertise, and long-term infrastructure support. The key question is whether the projects now move from political agreements into financing and construction, particularly in nuclear energy, refining, and port development. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio says Washington is imposing sanctions on International Criminal Court President Tomoko Akane and senior trial lawyer Abdoulaye Seye. Rubio says the move is a response to what he describes as the court's continued actions against the United States and Israel, arguing that the ICC has exceeded its authority and threatened national sovereignty. Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz says Israel will continue military operations against Hamas in Gaza and maintain pressure until what he describes as remaining security threats are removed. His post reinforces the government's position that the campaign will continue and that Israel does not intend to reduce military pressure at this stage. French President Emmanuel Macron highlights a milestone for French spaceflight. Sophie Adenau has become the first French woman to conduct a spacewalk. Adenau carried out the mission outside the International Space Station together with NASA astronaut Anil Menon, marking a historic first for France's human spaceflight program.